Welcome to the Inside Out Culture podcast. I'm Kath Bishop.
And I'm Colin Ellis. And on this episode, we are going to be answering your questions. Now, I don't know about you, Kath, but every time I do a speech at a conference or a workshop, I'm always asked lots of questions. Actually thinking about it, the two questions I get asked most is when I speak in Australia, people say, you say you're from Liverpool, but where does your Liverpool accent gone? So I have to then go, what, you're talking? It's right here, I just haven't used it. And then when I'm speaking in Europe, people ask me if I can get them an Australian visa. So we should do a show about stereotypes. Not all Liverpudlians have bags full of passports and visas. But joking aside, yeah, lots of culture questions. I think that there are very specific questions that people have at a moment in time. Here's a thing that I'm dealing with. Is that something you get asked lots of questions as well?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's almost sometimes people don't have space to go. And what we want to create actually is that space where you can ask a question that you might feel stupid to ask, or there's just no gap on the agenda to ask. So I do find people have questions, but they're nervous about them. Is it a good culture question, or should I be asking this? So, that's really part of the reason for doing the podcast, isn't it? To create a space for us to have conversations about culture. And one of the things that I notice with questions about culture is there often isn't a right or wrong answer. And that's why sometimes people find culture different or difficult. And it certainly is slightly different from other finite parts of the job where you're just getting stuff done and ticking off tasks and, adding up profit margins. It is different and we need to be in a different mindset. So sometimes I find also that questions come and they want some silver bullet, some magic answer. And so often, I find that I need to reframe the answer, and we might be sort of thinking about, what's the premise behind the answer, and how might we want to look at it differently rather than say, here's your answer. And that's the beauty for me. That's the fascination around culture, is that it actually gives us space to explore and find out how we might shape our cultures to be even better than they are.
Yeah, often it's just not linear. The answer's never a linear thing. Whenever someone asks me a question, oh, I'm dealing with this issue right now, I always need some context. I always need to understand,
Yes.
where are you at a point in time? What's happening in and around you right now? What aspiration does your organization have? What do you feel that the root cause is? But I definitely think that, and we're really encouraging people to email us at insideoutculture@gmail.com. Any questions that you have, we won't kind of name if you want to give us contacts, that's great. We won't name you. We won't say, I have a question here from Keith at Coventry Hospital who says, my leaders, we won't do that. But, just let us know what your question is. If there's a little bit of context, and we're more than happy to answer it on the show.
Great. So let's kick off.
Let's kick off. Well, I've got one for you, Kath, straight away. Let's just get straight into it. So if culture isn't part of what I do, and I know that it should be, where do I start?
Yeah, that's a good question, isn't it? If the thing is that often in our organizations, we're not spending time on this. We're not scheduling it. We're not putting it in the electronic calendar. We've got a meeting about the tasks, about the next stage of the projects, but we're not always thinking about how. And so I guess that's where I would start, is to say, what you want to be asking and thinking about is how does stuff get done? Not what are you doing, but how. So the first thing really is to observe and start to understand, and maybe thinking back to your black book from the first episode, maybe start writing down a few things. So you might take a particular way in which you do things. You might look at decision making. You might look at how you share feedback, how you communicate in times of stress, and just think, how do we do it? So does everyone have a voice? Who speaks first? Who makes the ultimate decision? What does it feel like as a conversation? How honest are people? You become like an observer, first of all. Get curious about your culture and start noting down behaviors and certain situations, perhaps things where you feel a bit uncomfortable or things where you feel really energized and motivated, and think, what was it that created that? It won't be the task. It will be the experience that you've created with your colleagues around it. So get curious, start noticing behaviors and writing down how things get done.
Yeah, that's a great answer, Kath. And I think for me, that's how I started as a manager, is just what are those little moments. We call it employee experience these days, but there's often, it isn't a demonstrable experience. It isn't all written down. So I completely agree. What are those micro experiences that kind of make up your working day? So yeah, that's a great way to start. Okay, next question.
So, right, this is one that comes up a lot. So I'm really interested in your answer. Is banter still okay?
Oh wow, we're getting straight into the difficult ones here. So banter. I mean, the short answer is yes, and there's an and. So banter, if you're not familiar with it, it's where you exchange, I suppose, remarks or comments in a playful way, I would say. Um, Except that's not always been the case with banter. Now the thing with banter is that I said yes, and yes, it is still possible, providing that there are strong relationships, that there's an understanding of how to behave today, not 5 years ago, not 10 years ago, not 15 years ago, that it's within the context of what you do, and you've made some agreements. You've made some agreements of what's appropriate, what's not, and you've really, one of the things that I do a lot is create team agreements, and you do it all within those team agreements. But banter really requires understanding at a personality level. It requires that you understand each other. It requires that you're self-aware. It requires trust. It requires, like I said, a commonality. And banter in one team will be completely different to banter in another team. I've worked with teams where they've maybe teased each other in a particular way, and then they've gone and worked with another team, and they're like, "Oh, this team's completely different. Everyone's so touchy." And I was like, "Well, no, because you had established relationships over here. You had a common language. You can't lift and drop that. We can't copy culture. Everybody's kind of subculture is slightly different." I think where it starts to get into a real gray area is where people see demeaning people, harassing people as banter, or using words to threaten and harass, or inappropriate language. "Oh, this is all banter." And, I still hear, Kath, and you probably heard it yourself, "Oh, people are too touchy these days." Or you can't say anything, generationally. You can't say anything these days. But there hasn't really been that recognition that kind of things have moved on. There are certain things you can say. There are certain things you can't say. I think there's still some people who kind of hark back to what they think is the good old days. But yes, banter is still possible. The best teams, the most vibrant cultures have heaps of fun. And often there are those little comments at each other's expense, but it's done in a real playful way. There's never a need for an apology afterwards, because the team agreement is in place of how they'll work together and behave.
Yeah, so it's trust first, isn't it? I definitely find that there have been quite a few cultures where there hasn't been great diversity, and then when you bring other people into the team, the banter continues, but it really doesn't land well because you haven't got the relationships. You're not thinking about the impact that it now has on a broader set of people, and that we've seen a lot in the news about in the UK, for example, banter in the army being used in a very bullying way, in a very misogynistic way. And so, we need to be really alive to that. So I think I feel that, let's start building trust and thinking about building trust. And then sometimes, banter, common language can evolve from that and be very powerful. But just focus on deepening those relationships first.
Yeah, yeah. And what I would add to that, Kath, is that language evolves social culture. So social culture is part of the fabric of which we build our working culture, kind of what happens in our days outside of work. It evolves all of the time. Social culture doesn't just stop. Language doesn't just stop at a point in time when we're born. And, people often say, "Oh, I'm just not comfortable to say things anymore." That's all part of the education process. It doesn't matter how old we are. If you want to be relevant in today's world, you constantly have to educate yourself on what's, kind of what's appropriate, what's not, how to talk about things. I think sometimes we have a set and forget mindset when it comes to work, is this is the way that I'm used to working. And we see it in hybrid work. This is the way that I'm used to working. And so this should always be the way, when that's simply just not true.
So context matters. Right. Next
Context
question.
definitely matters. Yeah. Question three. Oh, this one that comes up all the time, Kath. How do I measure culture?
Oh, yes. I think we probably need a whole episode on this one.
Hmm.
It's really important because often the metrics that we have don't measure culture. And that's part of why we're not noticing it, valuing it, developing it, shaping it, understanding it. And part of that is because we have a real love of short term quantitative metrics. We count stuff and things, not human experiences. So for me, meaningful measurement of culture requires us to start looking much more at qualitative data. So people's experiences, how they're feeling, the impact, their emotions, their reactions, and to be really listening. And so that requires a very different process. You're not going to shovel that in a spreadsheet. It's about really thinking the numbers you have got actually have a whole set of human stories behind them. Do you know what they are? Are people burnt out in delivering this set of quarterly figures, or are they super engaged, innovating, and ready to go, and perform even higher at the next in the next quarter? So you need to understand the stories behind the figures that we collect and start to get better at qualitative measuring. And that can mean a lot of things. Now, the interesting thing is that often people want a framework, and I find they say, tell me how to measure it. Like there's one measure. There isn't one measure because it's complex. It's about all of us, our behaviors, our norms, our mindset, our feelings, our experiences. And so we can't get that all in one snapshot. So you often have to evolve what you're measuring, ask different questions, constantly ask yourself, what else matters that I don't know about yet, that I need to find out about? And so the process of actually creating your measures is as powerful as understanding then the stories that come out. So the process of, and it takes some time with teams because it actually requires you to think, what do we really want to achieve? What's the impact that we want to have on others in our business, with our customers? What's the impact that we want to, the experience we want to create as a team? So it's often a brilliant process for getting really clear on that, which can then enable, it can be a brilliant building block for sustained performance and brilliance. So it's a very helpful process, but you don't want to rush that conversation. In itself, that conversation has huge value. So we've got to think qualitative. We need to be thinking about how we get under the surface at the stories. And it's also not about how do we prove everything's okay? Because I've heard that quite recently as well. How do we get the information that says everything's okay? We've got lots of complex human beings in our organization, and they'll have good days and less good days. So we shouldn't be trying to prove everything's okay. We need to be seeking to understand the genuine stories, listening, understanding, and then thinking, okay, what could I do that would shape the environment to help people have an even better experience?
It's a perfect blueprint for how you should measure culture. And yet most people, certainly in my experience, shovel into a spreadsheet. I love that phrase. They do. It's like, what's our engagement score? Let's ask everybody a million questions, generate heaps of disengagement in order to get a score. I think you're absolutely spot on. I'm a big fan of pulse surveys, short, sharp. What's that
Yes.
feeling right now? I think that, too many surveys ask too many questions
Yeah.
when shorter is better. Kath, I think organizations need to, especially now reputationally, I'm doing a speech on Thursday about cultural reputational governance, which is a big one for leaders and boards, is they need to pay attention to the Glassdoor score. So Glassdoor is a website where employees talk about their experiences. And so there's now an external measure of culture because it's not a black box, as we've said in previous podcasts. But you're absolutely right. Those qualitative measures are key.
Typically boards don't actually have good data at the moment on their culture. They're responsible, and if there's a reputational crisis, it's going to land at their door, and they'll have to bring in some independent reviewer to look at the culture because they don't actually know. They might have a staff engagement survey, but that is just the tiniest bit. In fact, really, it's a hint about what you need to find out more about. You need to then dig underneath it, not look at an engagement survey and go, oh, great, well, let's just get 5% higher in some of these areas next year. Really understand what has led people to score this high and to score this lower. We want to find out about both those things. So yes, there's a lot to do to change the information that senior leadership and boards get on this. Okay, let's move on. Next question. This is for you. And I think this is one you've thought about a lot. So I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on this. How do we bridge gaps between generations?
It is, and I'm doing a talk on this tomorrow night. I did one last week on generation. How timely is this? So the short answer is start talking about difference. Most people still just generally don't understand generations. Often we'll hear people say, "Oh, the different generation." I was like, "Okay, well, what generation do you think they were born in?" And there are four generations in the workforce for the first time ever. We've never had four generations in the workforce because of the extension of the retirement age, because people are getting into work earlier as well. So we've got baby boomers, we've got Generation X, we've got millennials, we've got Generation Z, and of course, a generation. We're kind of brought together by the world events that shaped us really, and the things that we had access to, the things that we didn't have access to, and of course, a big part of this is how we were raised by our parents. And typically, for those, I'm a father myself, Kath, I know that you're a parent, is what we do is we take our own experiences and we say, I will do this, I won't do that. And then we kind of look at what's happening within the social context and we say, okay, well, this is how we'll bring our children up. But managers don't really understand this. I've said this in the past, I feel for managers because they're never really given the skills to create great culture. There's never a program. There are leadership development programs, but there's not really anything that gives them the practical skills on how to build culture. Because it's not as simple as putting everybody into a box either and saying, right, okay, so you were born in 2013,
Yeah.
therefore you're Generation Z. You can't do that because there's also your personality. There's also kind of where you were born and the family and all of these kind of things that shape
Mm.
us. So I think taking the time to actually build connection and talk about, well, kind of what was your upbringing, what shaped you, how familiar are you with technology, what language you use. I had a manager who said to me last week after I did this talk, he said, do I have to change the way that I speak? I was like, well, absolutely not. We're not asking you to work against your biology, but you have to be cognizant of the different language, the different terminology, the different ways that technology is used. And he then went on to say, oh, management's getting harder. Which, I replied, well, managing other people's kids has always been hard, but it's what you're paid to do. And it's your job to understand the nuance within each generation without putting people into a box. For me, as soon as you look for ways to create division, then you've got literally no chance of setting up a vibrant culture. But what are those events that shaped kind of the baby boomer generation, the Generation X, millennials and Gen Z, and just have an open conversation about, this is what I'm familiar with. These are the experiences. And I don't think we put enough time. We've talked about this before, Kath. We don't put enough time within our organizations to actually create those relationships and create that level of understanding.
Yeah, I love that. I'm still really thinking about your comment early on where you were saying that so much of our upbringing impacts on how we parent, how we lead, how we manage others. And I always think about that when I'm doing work developing teams, thinking about the first team experience is our family or the environment we're brought up in. And that has a huge impact on how we see power, relationships, influencing. And if we're not careful, we could be taking some bad habits as well as hopefully some good habits from our childhood. But do we really stop and think about it? Gosh, am I like acting out almost how I would with a sibling when I'm feeling defensive about something? And a lot of that goes on. So we have this kind of incongruence between being intellectually very clever as an engineer or a lawyer or whatever our technical skills is, but potentially behaving still a bit like a teenager. So we need to really understand our behaviors, don't we? And think about the impact on others and bring that lens to work alongside our technical, cognitive, intellectual lens.
Yeah, and I've long been a fan of reverse mentoring. So this is where you take different people from
Mm.
different generations. I remember working with the CEO of an organization, I think it was in New Zealand, and he said, I'm afraid of what I don't know in today's generation. And so I paired him with with someone who was 20 who just started, and they created this relationship based on different viewpoints, how they saw the world, how they saw social events. One of the things that's in our workplaces right now is employee activism. It's not something, as Kath, you and I, both Generation X, it's not something that we were familiar with outside of a union movement. But employee activism is where as employees you get together and say, we don't agree with what the organization's standpoint on this particular thing. And it really opened his eyes. He was just like, I would never have done that as an employee. I would never have pushed back on my organization and told the CEO I disagreed with him. I said, well, that's the world has changed as we see it as our responsibility as humans, not just from an environment perspective, but also from a global events perspective, to actually question what our organization is doing in the world. Yeah.
And there's a book that I think I might have mentioned once before, which is coming out. It's by Megan Wright and John Higgins, and they wrote a book, Speak Up, I think about 2018, 2019, but they've got a second edition coming out, and it has extra chapters around employee activism, which is part of Megan Wright's speciality of research at Asridge. So look out for that. That's coming out. This whole concept of, yes, having a voice, having autonomy at work, which is really crucial to motivation and to making sure we get the best ideas from everyone in the organization. But it can feel something that leaders and managers might feel nervous about when really we want them to get excited about.
Okay, next question, Kath, for you. No one talks about culture at work. Imagine that. No one talks about culture at work. How can I start a conversation about it?
It wouldn't happen if we were there, would it?
Oh, definitely not.
Problem.
We'd be talking about it too much. Can we just get on with the work?
Let's go do some tasks, Kath, Colin. So yeah, it's a good one, because actually it is an issue. The rhythm of work is so task obsessed that there's all these unspoken experiences going on that everyone's aware of, but no one's talking about. And it's the elephant in the room, how we do things. So how do we start to, recognize the elephant, sort of lift the lid off what's happening underneath that we all go home and think about and are painfully aware of? I think one of the tools that is of most help for us in terms of conversations and behaviors is to think about learning and to keep using the word how. So I'm probably going to say this quite a lot in lots of our conversations. The word how is your friend when you're thinking about culture. We tend to just think about what, the tasks, and when, the deadlines. But culture gives you a way of thinking about how you're going to do those tasks, and it gives you a way to continually improve and a way to learn. So if we can think about how we do something, then we start to recognize the culture we have, and we can then start to think about, well, how will we do it better next time? Because the way to improve is not just to do more work longer hours, do more tasks. It's often about doing your tasks with greater quality, creating more value, collaborating, making sure you've had the conversations you need to have open and honest and challenging early to avoid problems later down the line. So I think to start having conversations where we say, how could we do something better? Let's just review, reflect how we did something last time. And we can look at sort of little moments in time. So you just start again with a small error, and you might say, how could we improve the way we make decisions so that everybody's even clearer about where we end up, so that we make sure all the diverse views that we've carefully recruited into this team are fed into that decision, to make sure, we're then really fully aligned afterwards. Or you might just take something small, but regular, like your team meetings, and say, I like our team meetings, but I wonder if we could do them even better. How might we make them better? And I reckon everyone will have 2 or 3 points about how you could make them better. And once we start to involve people's views and we start to notice how, then people will want to join in that conversation. It's not that we haven't noticed it. Yeah, we sort of subconsciously take it in, maybe even consciously when things are difficult. We all have those feelings of discomfort, of awkwardness, of embarrassment, of, I'm really uncomfortable with the way something's been phrased. Yeah, we all have those moments. They're happening in our bodies. Often there's a physiological reaction. We blush, or our temperature goes up slightly, or, our hands get a bit sticky. And so it's really starting to help conversations about how. And a good way to do it is to get that sense of, how can we do something better? How else might we do it? What alternative is there to the way we currently do something? So learning is your friend. Learning is what we like to see in our cultures, because it creates that sense of momentum and personal growth and development and performance. And so, it sets off a whole positive chain of behaviors. And so that's what my recommendation would be for starting a conversation. Start thinking about learning and asking some more how questions.
And I love the team meeting, Kath, an initiative I undertook with one team a couple of years ago. We had on a standing item on the agenda called One Thing. And every month, there was a monthly team meeting. Every month they had to pick one thing that they were going to work on within the team. And I specifically remember they had like they'd already started to think 6 months out, and it was like emails, number of meetings, emails and meetings for
Yeah.
corporate still. But it was also about feedback. It was like, what's one thing that we want to address? What's one thing that we can improve on to help us get better at doing what we do? So I love that idea. I think that's really great.
Okay, last question, Colin. How do we hire people who can improve our culture?
Yeah, of course. It's a great question. Building a vibrant culture. When you actually take the time to methodically build a culture, and I'm making it sound like a long process, it needn't be a long process. But what it becomes is a magnet for great employees. So I think, how do you hire people to improve our culture? Well, the first thing you can do is build a great culture in the first place. And I'm not just talking about writing about culture on a website. Make it something that people talk about with their friends. What is unique about your culture? What do you do that's different? It might be slightly off the wall in terms of the activities that you undertake. I'm not talking about being wacky, but what are those things that we do to enhance employee wellness? What are those things that we do to maintain a level of productivity, but also give people a sense of purpose? And for me, the best thing that you can do is to connect it to the values that you have as an organization. Now, we'll definitely do a show on values, because most organizations are really bad at values. I think the Maitland Group, it might be about 8 years ago now, they did a survey of the FTSE 100 companies in the UK and found that most of them had the same four values, like innovation, collaboration, integrity, none of which are actually values. They're just words. Integrity is what you get when you live your values. But I think when you have a strong set of values, what you can then do is use them as a basis to hire people. Often we hear, Kath, it's like, oh, we need to hire for culture fit. And that's not really a thing, because certainly
Yeah.
cultures are made up of lots of different subcultures. And so really at an organization level, sports teams are the same. You generally got a vision, a sense of aspiration, a set of values, which is kind of emotional principles that bind us together. But then you have different ways of working with each other depending on which team you're working in. And so the interview really needs to focus on it. How does this person, or how will this person contribute to the values of the organization? And too often I think organizations hire people because they're just desperate. They'll just take someone with a pulse, rather than because they've got so much work, rather than, oh, this person can really contribute in the values. A great example of this is asking standard interview questions. Like if you ask standard questions, you're going to get a standard person, someone who's revised, who's very good at interviewing, rather than being, a little bit agile, a bit nimble, and asking people, well, how they would actually contribute to values. So I think that, what you want to do is make sure that you spend an appropriate amount of time in hiring. What are those values? What are those emotional states you're looking for? For me, your CV gets you an interview, but it's your personality and it's your contribution to values that gets you the job. And they are then the people that can really add to your culture.
Yeah, that's a great phrase. So I definitely echo that. Get away from the CV once you're in the interview. CVs really only tell you about access to education. They're really quite narrow. They won't help you find out about culture. So you need to ask some different questions. And I think then you're right. The values focus for me is part of understanding the intrinsic motivation. So, what are the things that are going to motivate you to do your best work? And so, asking questions around purpose and values, learning. So, what are the things? How do you want to grow and develop? What do you want to learn? What do you want to get better at? And asking that sense of what are the things that would help you to feel you belong? When have you felt that you belong to a group before? Get that sense of how a person tunes in to groups and communities in their life and the sorts of things that they will bring to and kind of contribute to your community at work. So, yeah, get away from the CV, intrinsic motivation and values.
Okay, well, that's it for our first questions episode, Kath. That was some really gnarly questions in there. But what we want to do is really encourage people to email us. We'd like to do these episodes regularly. We recognise that there are people out there with a burning question. Often you don't know who to turn to. So why not, Kath and I? You can email us at insideoutculture@gmail.com.
Yeah, brilliant. We hope some of those answers were helpful. We'd love to hear more feedback. And thank you for testing us. Pretty tough
Yeah,
questions too.
fantastic.